to everyone who organised this, and thanks everyone for coming. I'd like to start off, like we start off in Australia, by acknowledging the sovereign peoples of the land on which we're meeting. Traditionally in Australia we start off by acknowledging the traditional owners, but I think rather than traditional owners, they're ongoing sovereign peoples. I'd also like to acknowledge the Bindal and the Wulgarukaba, who are the sovereign peoples of the land where I live and work. And I like to point out that I'm a migrant to Australia and a visitor to New Zealand, and I can only be in either place because of the historical and ongoing dispossession of those sovereign peoples. So working through the contradictions of that starts off by acknowledging it. And I'd also like to start off by just telling you a little bit about myself. I think who we are and the sort of social spaces that we occupy fundamentally shape how we see things. And I don't expect you to come away from a half an hour talk with me knowing anything really much about me. But just a couple of key points that might sort of explain some of my perspectives. I grew up in the United States. I come from Cherokee and white parents, but I grew up with lots and lots and lots of white privilege. I'm what some people describe as a digital native. I started using computers in kindergarten, and I love social media. You can see my Twitter handle on the slide, so if you want to tweet at me during the presentation. David also suggested hashtag #I2am_Auckland as a good hashtag if you're a social media user. I love memes. There's a lot of them in the slides. And so I think all of these things are why I'm interested in the ways that marginalized groups of people can use social media and digital tools more generally as a space of subverting the mainstream. And I've chosen this term subversion over some other terms that might also be appropriate, like resistance or protest, originally because it alliterated and I liked it. But when I actually thought about it, it really makes a lot of sense. So this definition comes from Wikipedia, which admittedly isn't a great source, but it explains that subversion is an attempt to transform the established social order and its structures of power, authority, and hierarchy. It refers to the process by which the values and principles of a system are contradicted or reversed. And I love that idea of contradicting the values. It comes from the Latin, subvertere. I don't speak Latin, I'm probably saying that wrong. Wikipedia translates this as overthrow, but other dictionaries have more literally translated it as to turn from below. That idea of turning from below, I think, is really evocative as well. And I think subversion, then, is a really useful term to describe much of what's happening on the internet, which can be, but isn't always, overtly protest. People aren't always engaging in activism when they use digital tools, but they're often subverting in some ways. I mean, aside from the sort of banal everyday posting that happens, often it is attempting in some way to transform structures of power. In my talk today, I'll outline some of my research into social media subversion, some of which has been published and some is in review. In my work, I focus on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Australia, offline activism in my PhD, and more recently, online activism that people are using. And I'll use these examples to think through the points that you can see on the slide. I should also explain briefly that I have come to the point where I am through a couple of different perspectives and outlooks. My first paper, Protest 2.0, was quite critical of social media activism, not dismissive of it, but I didn't think it was as good as offline activism. The more I did research in this area, the more I came to see the value of digital activism. But I was still arguing along the theoretical lines of traditional social movement theory and saying online activism is just an online version of what's always been happening. It's really through teaching undergraduate students and dealing with these issues with students that I've come to see that actually the theories that we've used for decades probably don't really explain exactly what's happening online. So So in some ways they're still useful, but I think we need to be developing new theories. So I'd also like to acknowledge the students, past and present, in my class, Power and Protest in a Globalizing World, for their help in thinking through some of these issues. So whether a social movement happens online or offline, there's a few criteria that allow us to define it as a social movement. It needs to be deliberate and sustained. That means it happens on purpose and over time. So people aren't swept up in the madness of crowds, as social movement theorists used to think in the 1930s. They actually do things thoughtfully and on purpose. It also needs to be a collective shared action by a group of people, though the nature of that group can be quite loosely defined, and we're seeing that increasingly in online activism with groups like Anonymous, who may never actually meet in person. And a social movement is an attempt to do something about some kind of inequality. And I use the term perceived inequality in my definition of social movement, not in a dismissive way, but because there might be lots of inequalities in the world, but until somebody defines it as an inequality and something that needs to be fixed, nothing will get done about it. So you need to perceive the inequality in order to change it. Activism can take a variety of different forms, and I think this is where the distinction between online and offline becomes a bit more apparent, at least in terms of how they're treated by social movement theorists. Scholarship is starting to shift more and more, but we still have a tendency to assume that online activism takes less commitment, less effort, and therefore should be taken less seriously. And I think that we need to move away from that line of thinking. Because what this fails to recognize is the way that online communities have become so embedded in our everyday lives. Sharing something on Facebook might only take a click, but it doesn't mean that it's a meaningless activity. It's about sending a message to your network, which is often an offline network as well as an online network. It might be family and friends that you see every day. And so taking a political stance in those social networks can actually be kind of a big thing to do. Not always, but it can be. But even if it isn't a big thing, information sharing is an important form of activism, because the more people identify an inequality and perceive it, the more likely it is to change. For a movement to be successful in an online space, it needs to resonate with online communities. And this is why the assumption that online activism is merely an extension of offline activism is flawed. There are different social spaces with different norms and values. And the internet is a hugely diverse place, and there isn't one particular language of the internet. But as a general rule, the things that pick up the most traction are either very funny or very emotional. So this is Civil Disobedience Cat, who you saw on the last slide was just a funny cat meme, so that's its own internet language. But here it's combined with another meme, the pepper spraying cop meme. And it takes on a bit of a different meaning. The pepper spraying cop is a good example of how humor can be used to spread really important, serious messages. The original photo, which you can see on the slide, was taken at an Occupy protest in the United States University, UC Davis. The police officer that you can see in the photo, who's not a police officer anymore, he walked down a line of protesters, and you can see we're sitting on the ground in peaceful civil disobedience. And he, quite casually, from the looks of things, pepper sprayed them in the face. This happened in November 2011. This isn't humorous at all. There's nothing funny about this picture. It's actually really quite difficult to look at. But through humor, the power of the police officer and the police, I think, as an institution, was subverted. Not by sharing this image itself is confronting, but it wasn't shared nearly as much as the memes that were created out of it. So by superimposing the pepper spraying cop on Bambi's forest animals, by superimposing him on the signing of the US Constitution, Or the George Seurat painting of people having a picnic at the lake. It points out the fact that he's using his power against people who really aren't doing anything to deserve it. They're literally sitting on the ground in much the same way these people in these paintings are. And so using humor points out the power relationships in a really powerful way. So humor is a really important tool for subversion because making people laugh breaks down the barriers that they might have. They might see the original photo of the pepper spraying cop and think, I'm not going to read that article because I don't really want to read another thing about protest. But if they see a funny picture and then find out what it's about, they're more receptive to the information that you're sharing. And I know lots of people who are aware of what happened in that Occupy protest because of the pepper spraying cop meme. Some examples from my research with Aboriginal activists also point to the importance of humor in social media activism. The hashtag White Proverbs was a global discussion that trended in January 2014. And there were thousands and thousands of tweets. I pulled out the tweets from Australia and about Australia for my research. And this is a paper that's currently in review. So the White Proverbs conversation was mainly non-white users tweeting about the microaggressions that they hear on a regular basis. Hashtag White Proverbs allowed readers to LOL while their attention was drawn to the very important concept of white privilege. So about Australia, these are just a couple. People have been invading and colonizing for millions of years. It's just human nature. Or he only claimed to be Aboriginal once he knew he'd get some cash for it. Or you're the first hot Asian/black I've ever met. Hashtag it's a compliment. And then from Victoria Greaves, but I just want to help you. And that's a really, really common one that sort of underlies a lot of academic research and government services and so on. So this is an example of how irony can be used to disrupt power and intolerance and correct naivety. So I saw lots of people engaging with these tweets that would say, but being told you're hot is a compliment. And that opened up space for discussions about why it's actually not a compliment to be told that you're the first hot Asian or black person I've ever met. So this is a really good example of something that doesn't fit the traditional understanding of activism. It doesn't seem like tweeting a white proverb. It's not quite the same as marching in the streets with a raised fist and a banner. But participants themselves might not have thought that they were participating in activism when they were doing this. But these things are subversive in that they attempt to shed light on and thus change the dominant power structures in society. In this case, the racial power structures. The other way that power is often subverted on the internet is by touching on people's emotions. And I think this is something that the I2 and Auckland videos do really well, as we'll see in the videos later on. Like laughter, making people a little bit weepy is a really good way to ensure that they've engaged with the subject matter and that they're more receptive to the information that you're presenting to them. So in another local to me example, a few weeks ago there was a really damning investigation into the treatment of young people in detention. And this is a system where Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are vastly overrepresented. So it was really an investigation into the treatment of Indigenous young people in incarceration. The report was itself quite emotional to watch, but it really got quite controversial when shortly afterwards the Australian newspaper published this cartoon that you can see. I'm not sure if this made it to the news over here at all, but it was big news in Australia. So there's a police officer holding a young person by the shirt saying, you'll have to sit down and talk to your son about personal responsibility. And then presumably his father holding a beer can saying, yeah, righto, what's his name then? And so there's a lot of stereotyping going on in this, even just in the visual depictions, but also in the sort of comment bubbles that they're saying. And understandably, people were upset about it. And so in response, hashtag was started on Twitter, Indigenous Dads. And so this featured Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people posting photos and stories of their fathers, of their partners fathering their children, or fathers themselves posting pictures of their own children. It was really quite heartwarming and emotional for lots of people, and it was luckily reported in the mainstream media as such. So you can see the examples on the slide. Ryan Griffin, who created the Aboriginal superhero show Clever Man, says, "Not only do I know my son's name, but I named a superhero after him." And Celeste Hunter posts a picture of her awesome dad, a proud Bardi Jawi man. And there were lots and lots of tweets like this, just of photos of people with their dads and stories about having good, positive father role models. And this is really important work to challenge stereotypes. And as you were saying in the welcome, it enables Indigenous people to have a voice and to have their own voice instead of the narrative being dictated for them by the mainstream media. And I think this kind of challenging of stereotypes is one of the key features of minority activism in digital spaces. Showing a public that actually there's lots of different ways to be Indigenous, that lots of people don't fit into those stereotypes is important. And I argue in a 2013 paper in Global Media Journal that it's an important form of activism in itself. And if I had thought of the term subversion earlier, I would have probably made that point instead of calling it activism. Because this breaking down of stereotypes might not be a recognizable form of activism, but it is really quite subversive. It's challenging the dominant way of thinking about people. It's turning from below the way that we think about Indigenous people. So the pepper spraying cop was stood down, and both hashtag white Proverbs and hashtag Indigenous Dads were reported in the mainstream media once they became really popular online. But beyond just getting coverage, how can social movements ensure that they're successful and that they can contribute to meaningful structural change? So not just getting one police officer stood down, but maybe changing the structure of the police state. So I suggest three, I think, good things that social movements can take into consideration. I sort of put that with a caveat that I'm sure there's lots of examples of successful campaigns that don't fit these three things, and so that's why I say they're sort of good things to do, not essential things to do. But these are the sort of general things that I see emerging. In traditional studies of social movements, one of the key criteria of movement success is having a clear target. And the same is true of digital activism. A social movement's activities need to be directed at someone. If a movement is a response to a perceived inequality, as I said earlier, the target is the person or group of people or structure that the movement has identified as either causing that inequality and or capable of fixing it. It's not as simple as just having a target though. The target needs to hear the message. So if I sit around in my tea room at work and talk to my friends about how terrible the government is, we have a clear target of our conversation. We're clearly directing it in a general direction of the government. But the government doesn't hear that, and so nothing is going to change. Likewise on social media. Online petitions are a good example. We can have lots and lots of internal conversations and collect lots of signatures on an online petition and express lots of displeasure. But if we're not directing our voices at a target, then nothing will change. So in the early days of digital activism, when I was doing my PhD, an Aboriginal group that I was working with asked me to set up an online petition in support of an Aboriginal man who was arrested for protesting. There's sort of lots of complex things behind that, but that's in a nutshell. I asked who the petition was to be directed to, and they sort of said the justice system. So I addressed it to the justice system, and we collected 300 or so signatures. But that petition just sort of existed on the internet. It was never directed to anyone. In fact, the case was decided before we did anything with it. The exciting thing about social media is that we do have this platform where we can speak directly to power holders. We can tweet at somebody or comment on Facebook pages or Instagrams, and Snapchat I think is a thing. I don't really know so much about that one. And even if the power holders themselves don't see it, they've probably got staff members who hopefully pass some of the anger along to them. And in doing this, we are not only directing our conversation at that power holder, but also broadcasting the conversation usually. So if we tweet at someone or comment on their Facebook page, our whole social network sees that thing as well. And potentially somebody else gets angry about that issue and does a similar thing. And if we think more broadly about digital activism into the strategies used by groups like Anonymous, the activism can actually be really quite directly targeted at power holders. Boycotts are a good example of a kind of social movement that's really enhanced by the clear targets that social media lets us have. So traditionally, a boycott, you don't buy a product for some sort of ethical reason. But with social media, you can not only boycott, but share what you're doing and why you're doing it, and spread the message about that boycott. And so in addition to losing sales, the company will also get bad publicity, which is a hugely important thing for many companies to think about. It would be idealistic to think that targets will always respond, so I'm not suggesting that, but every now and then they do. So I want to share an example of a success. This is a couple of years ago. In preparation for Australia Day, Aldi, the grocery store chain, released a line of patriotic t-shirts, one of which, you can see the red one, said, "Australia, established 1788. This is controversial, but also factually inaccurate. Controversial because Australia Day marks the day that the British began to colonize the continent. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people already refer to this day as Invasion Day or Survival Day to make it clear that they don't necessarily have a lot to celebrate about marking that day in history. It's also factually inaccurate because, as Melbourne newspaper The Age pointed out, technically Australia was not officially established until 1824, when it was agreed by the British Admiralty that the continent, then known as New Holland, would be officially known as Australia, after a recommendation by Governor Lachlan Macquarie in 1817. So there's lots of issues with the shirt, and again, as you can imagine, it was the source of a fairly immediate Twitter campaign. So just to give you a sense of timeline, the ad for these shirts went online on the 6th of January, and the shirts were due to be sold starting the 11th of January. So they were sort of trying to build up some attention, and they did, but not in the right way. So tweets like, "The established 1788 are particularly stupid," like a badge that says "I failed year 5 history class." Or Maria, who says, "They mean invaded in 1788, dumbasses." More importantly, people tweeted their disgust, as you can see in the tweet at the top. They tweeted at Aldi Australia. So instead of just being angry, they were directing it really clearly at the people who could make that decision. And they also tweeted the comment forum so that people could, through formal channels, express their discontent with what was happening and explain why. So I think it's the combination of the publicity and the tweeting, the comment form, and sort of responding directly to Aldi that made this campaign such a success, because the two things were happening at once. In this case, it took one day for Aldi to pull that design. By the 7th of January, they were no longer selling Australia established 1788. And this is, you know, it's a small campaign. It's not a huge win for social justice, but it was an important way to start some conversations about why Australia Day isn't celebrated universally on the continent. And those discussions were happening on social media as well as in the mainstream media. So this is a good example of cases like this where social media can actually really enhance what we're doing. and actually be really quite a quick and successful form of activism. So the next thing is having clear actions, clear things for people to do. Online campaigns with different levels of actions that people can take work better to engage people, to turn them into movement participants rather than just sort of the bystander public, and eventually turn them maybe even into activists rather than just perpetuating what's commonly called slacktivism. In the 1970s, Turner and Killian identified 4 levels of involvement in social movements, and I think their terminology needs a bit of updating for a digital world, but the idea is a good one. So they identify the insecure member who participates in some events but doesn't really feel like they belong, the rank and file member who comes along regularly, the ego involved who have internalized an activist identity, and I missed the first one, which is the interested spectator, so the people who watch and might be sort of curious about what's happening but they don't get involved themselves. And that idea of that sort of continuum of involvement is a useful thing to think about, whether you're doing activism offline or online, and how you can sort of get people to move up levels, ideally, and keep them from moving down levels. So for digital movements, it can be things like asking supporters to share information, engage in discussions, and then maybe even attend an event in real life. It's a good way of easing people in to become more involved. When those actions can make the connection between online participation and offline participation, it's even better, because people are more likely to internalize it if they're sort of participating in multiple ways. In a lot of ways, this is the same as offline activism. If you've ever been to a protest march or a rally or something, and there's nothing to follow up, there's no meeting afterwards, there's no petition to sign, or some way to feel like you're involved, it can be a bit anticlimactic. I'm like, right, what do I do now? So I think the same is true of online activism. It can be a little bit easier in online activism with just a bit of kind of strategic planning. Like if you have an image or a video, making sure the key information is embedded within it, because that's the thing that's going to get shared rather than a full text article. So some quite practical things. But it's also an important broader exercise for movements to think about. What is it that a movement wants apart from raising awareness? What actions are required to change the inequality that you're trying to change? And how can individuals contribute to those changes? What are some specific things that they can do? So one negative thing about the internet that it would be really glaringly obvious if I forgot to mention is the kind of reactions that activists can receive when they engage online. Trolling, we call it. Trolling can happen anywhere and anytime online, but somehow the issue of feminism seems to be the thing that attracts consistently the most disgusting kind of responses. Just as a quick anecdote, last year I had a student doing research on Tumblr feminism, and she presented a conference paper on Gamergate, and people live tweeted the title of her paper, I think, and she immediately received Twitter rape threats. So this is the kind of reaction that people have to feminism existing in an online space. On a larger scale, there's a lot of examples that I could have included that I don't want to because they're really quite offensive. I don't really want them on my slides. So this is an example that lets me talk about the issues without showing you some of the disgusting things that people tweet or Facebook. Aboriginal writer and activist Celeste Little was banned from Facebook earlier this year, several times, repeatedly, after sharing a website with this picture of the 2 Aboriginal women. So this is the image that was attached to the text of a speech that she had delivered at International Women's Day. The speech was actually about how women's bodies are objectified, but Aboriginal women's bodies are seen as more offensive somehow, and so it's quite telling what happened to her afterwards. So the picture shows 2 Aboriginal women painted up and ready for ceremony. with exposed nipples, God forbid. In this version of the photo, the nipples are pixelated because the editors of New Matilda, the website, didn't want it to keep getting people banned from Facebook. Little was reported to Facebook repeatedly for offensive content, but when she reported offensive comments that she received in response to this article, which were incredibly racist and misogynist, she received no response, or she received the response that the posts that the comments she had didn't reach community standards. So she was banned from Facebook for over a week for this image, but at the same time, this image was posted of Kim Kardashian, which was fine. So it really just sort of goes to show what she was talking about in her speech. So this is just an important reminder, one, that these platforms are not public spaces. They're companies that are there to make profit. They sell our data to advertisers. And so while they're really useful tools for digital activism, we do need to be aware of those contradictions. It's like going to a shopping mall to have an activist meeting, essentially. But activists who operate in these digital realms should be aware as well of the potential responses, the kind of trolling responses that you might get. And I suggest having a repertoire of predetermined reactions to those. So will it be that you respond ultra politely, correct factual inaccuracies, but not engage with the argument? Will you block and delete? Will you screenshot them and use them as the point for why your movement needs to exist? This is something that a lot of online feminists are beginning to do, almost making fun of the people that are trolling them. The last point for movements to consider in digital spaces is having clear constituents, and by that I mean a kind of sense of who we are and who they are, us and them kind of mentality. And this is one of these things that comes from offline social movement theory. Collective identity is really important. It's an area that's been studied quite a lot, and one of the things that I think remains similar in online activism. A collective identity is the shared feeling that we're all in this together. And it's most successful when individuals internalize that sense of shared identity. So individually, on their own, they still feel like they're a part of the movement. It isn't just when they're participating in something. The most visible ways of building collective identity are often the most easy to ridicule in online activism. So things like changing your profile photo to show support or raise awareness in something, like the rainbow Facebook photos. But what this does, again, it clearly states to your social networks that you have a particular political stance. And again, that's not something that we should take lightly. The success of this building of collective identity relies largely on movement constituents using social media prior to a campaign in order to discuss and debate movement issues. So to identify who they are as a group, so to sort of work out the rules and the shared meanings and so on. And also to determine who doesn't support the movement and sort of where the edges of that movement might be. And this identity building encompasses a lot of social movement activity that we don't identify as activism. So sort of everyday conversations, sharing news articles that are sort of related but not really part of the activism. Posting a profile photo or changing your display name to make a political point. These aren't really challenging power, not really sticking it to the man. But they do contribute to the overall sense of self of the social movement. Offline protests are often organized with lots and lots of meetings in advance, and those meetings are the space for participants to have debates and discussions and disagree and come to some sort of consensus on the issue. Online discussions are often more public, and so disagreements can be a little bit problematic because people say, if you can't even agree yourself, then how is anyone else supposed to know what you think? But it's important to have disagreements, and I think we'll come to a point where social movement disagreements are just sort of accepted parts of reality. So this building of collective identity is especially important for movements of people who have been historically marginalized. So Aboriginal people in my research, for example, have been categorized by the state. They've had their rules decided for them about their identity for more than 200 years. And they've also been subjected to negative representations by the mainstream media and the public. But using social media, Aboriginal people can decide for themselves, or they focus on these utopian claims that the internet will democratize everything, and it hasn't. And that's a pretty fair critique, but also kind of a unrealistic expectation of the internet. But more commonly, I think, we hear that social media is a waste of time, and that it doesn't actually contribute to social change. And I hope that most people who would come to a social media activism conference don't agree with that. But I think this conversation between a couple of people on Twitter really highlights some key issues. It points out that social media activists themselves raise these discussion points. So Bryn O'Brien has tweeted a link to an article and asks, why isn't there a plan for 500,000 of us to be in the streets? How do we make it happen? And Margaret Clark responded to say, I've been saying the same. Are we all wasting our energy on Twitter rage instead? And Margaret's daughter, actually, Christy, says, I don't think so. It doesn't take energy. It just serves as a reminder that action is needed. And Margaret asks, but do we feel we've done our bit by tweeting bad stuff? And that's a really important question. If we're only engaging with problems in the online space, then it could be problematic. But as Christy points out, determining effective strategic response takes time and discussion. And Twitter is one platform for said discussion. And there's lots of digital platforms for that discussion to happen. You can't just organize to have 500,000 people turn up in the streets without some planning. And social media offers a space for that planning to happen across geographical space, across time, and hopefully in a more inclusive way. So just to wrap up, I think the digital world is a really exciting space. It offers us the opportunities to engage in alternative discussions, to begin the work of subverting mainstream power. But we need to remember that it isn't a value-neutral place. Many of the inequalities that exist in society more broadly also exist online. So there's still issues of racism, sexism, ableism, homophobia, and so on and so on. These problems and issues, along with other issues like a lack of commitment, so people just clicking instead of actually really participating, don't mean that we should abandon digital activism. I don't even think that's necessarily possible in today's world where so much of our lives are bound up with the digital world. Instead, we need to continue that work of turning from below, of subverting the mainstream values that have for so long perpetuated these inequalities. Sometimes that will be through small campaigns like getting shirts taken off the shelves. Sometimes it will be through making people laugh or cry, and thus making them think. Sometimes it won't even look like activism, but that doesn't mean it's not subversive. So go out and create social change. Thanks.
Just on behalf of everyone here today, I'd like to present this to you as a token of our appreciation for coming all the way from Australia and giving us an insight to your work and what you have been doing. Before we break off for morning tea, we can have 5 to 10 minutes of question time. So if you do have any questions that you want to blurt out right now before they leave your mind whilst drinking some coffee, now's the time to do it. And we'll extend morning tea to come back at 10:35. So if you have any questions. Anybody?
I will ask about I don't know much about Twitter. The hashtag, what it does mean?
So a hashtag is like a keyword, so it's a way of categorizing your tweets. So if you tweet, and this also happens on Facebook now, if you add a hashtag, you can then search that hashtag and everything that's related to that will come up. So hashtagging I2M Auckland will collect all of the tweets that are about this event and everything that Auckland has done previously, or hashtag Indigenous Dads. You can then search Indigenous Dads and see everything that people have tweeted or shared on Facebook about that. I think it's really big also on Instagram. So it's a way of cataloging, but also a way of adding some commentary. So there was the tweet about white Proverbs with hashtag it's a compliment. So it's kind of a way of the tweeter adding a bit of commentary to what they're doing, pointing out why it's problematic in some ways.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed your presentation. Mine's more a mechanical question in terms of your research about what effectively changes constitutional mechanisms. What has been the most effective?
Do you mean constitutional like the Constitution?
Like if the best changes often at the highest levels. So that's really what I'm working on at the moment. So that's where my interest is. That's where my focus is. So.
Yeah, so I mean, I think often for those changes at the high levels, there needs to be a groundswell of support from below. So to some extent, sharing information and having discussions on social media is a good way of sort of shifting public opinion. But also it's that thing of targeting people in really high places. So people tweeting at Malcolm Turnbull in Australia, who's the Prime Minister for now. We change Prime Ministers a lot, if you've noticed. Or tweeting at the Human Rights Commissioner, for example, can be a really good way of making sure that they're aware of the kinds of conversations that are happening. In Australia, at the moment, we're having a debate about constitutional recognition. Should Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people be included in the Constitution? And most people think yes. There's no camps on either side, so some people think no because it would be reverse racist. And other people think no because Indigenous people themselves don't want to be written into a racist document. So there's sort of a range of opinions about that, but it's a very social media heavy campaign, the Recognize campaign. So it's happening a lot on Facebook and Twitter and YouTube. And so hashtag Recognize is a really fruitful discussion space where people are sort of working through some of these issues.